The first time I realized my husband was cheating on me, I was sitting in a hospital chair, half asleep, attached to an IV, while chemotherapy slowly dripped into my arm. And the strange part wasn't the cheating, at least, not at first. The strange part was how polite he sounded about it. "Hey," he whispered on the phone in the hallway, "I miss you too." I remember the moment very clearly, because when you're in a hospital long enough, you start noticing small details, footsteps, voices, the sound of someone trying to speak quietly. And that day, the quiet voice outside my hospital room belonged to my husband. My name is Claire. 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. It happened quickly. A routine checkup, a test, then another test, then suddenly, a room full of doctors explaining treatment plans, chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, all the words that make your world feel smaller overnight. My husband Daniel was there the day we got the diagnosis, holding my hand, promising everything would be okay. "We'll get through this together," he said. And at the time, I believed him. For the first few weeks of treatment, Daniel played the role perfectly. He drove me to appointments, sat beside my hospital bed, bought flowers, texted friends and family updates. Everyone said the same thing. "You're lucky to have such a supportive husband." But what people don't understand about illness is how much time it creates. Long hours, long waiting rooms, long moments where nothing happens except thinking, which is exactly how I started noticing things. Daniel texting constantly, turning his phone away when I looked at it, leaving the room to take calls. At first, I ignored it, because when you're fighting cancer, you don't want to fight anything else. But the moment that changed everything happened during my 4th chemotherapy session. I had fallen asleep in the treatment chair. The medication makes everything heavy, slow, dreamlike. When I woke up, Daniel wasn't in the room, which wasn't unusual. The sessions lasted hours. People stepped out all the time. But then I heard his voice from the hallway, soft, careful, almost affectionate. "I wish I was with you instead," he said quietly. I froze, because there's something about certain sentences that instantly tells you the truth, and that sentence was not meant for a sick wife. There was a pause. Then Daniel laughed softly. "No, she's asleep." My chest felt tight, not from the chemo, from something else. Then he said something that made the entire situation suddenly very clear. "Don't worry," he whispered. "She doesn't suspect anything." For a moment, the hospital room felt completely silent. No machines, no nurses, no sounds at all. Just the realization that while I was sitting there fighting cancer, my husband was whispering to another woman in the hallway, and strangely, the emotion I felt first wasn't anger. It was clarity. Because betrayal during hard times tells you everything you need to know about someone. Anyone can stay when life is easy. But the moment life becomes difficult, you discover who they really are. So instead of confronting Daniel when he walked back into the room, I did something else. I smiled. "How was the call?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "Work." Of course it was. But what Daniel didn't realize in that moment was that I had already made a decision. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to accuse him. And I definitely wasn't going to warn him. Because if Daniel wanted to lie while I was fighting cancer, I was going to give him something far more interesting. Attention? The kind of attention that turns ordinary people into something very different. Famous. Once suspicion enters your mind, it changes the way you hear everything. Every whisper, Every text message notification, every excuse that once sounded normal, suddenly, all of it feels rehearsed. After the phone call outside the hospital room, I didn't confront Daniel. Not that day, not the next day either, because people who believe they are safe make mistakes, and Daniel believed he was completely safe. For the next 2 weeks, I watched him carefully. The pattern appeared quickly. Daniel always stepped out during my chemo sessions, usually around the same time, usually for work calls. He also started staying late at the hospital cafeteria, even when my treatments were finished. At first glance, it looked like stress, like a husband trying to manage work while supporting a sick wife. But once you know the truth, the details reveal something else. One afternoon, Daniel left his phone on the chair beside me, something he rarely did. The screen lit up a few seconds later. A message appeared from someone named Natalie. "I wish you were here tonight." My heart didn't race. I didn't panic. I simply stared at the message because suddenly the entire picture started forming. Natalie, not a client, not a coworker's spouse, not a random contact, someone he was emotionally involved with. The next message arrived seconds later. "It's hard pretending you belong to someone else." That sentence explained everything, but the most interesting message came next. "Is she feeling worse today?" For a moment, I felt something close to laughter rising in my chest, because Daniel wasn't just cheating, he was using my cancer as conversation material. The illness I was fighting had become part of their romance. I locked the phone screen gently and placed it exactly where it had been, because Daniel had made a critical mistake. He assumed I was too weak to notice, too sick to pay attention, too distracted by treatment to think clearly. But illness doesn't make you blind. Sometimes it makes you more aware than ever. That night, I searched the name. Natalie Brooks. The results appeared quickly. She worked at the same financial firm as Daniel. Marketing department, 29 years old, bright smile, perfect hair, social media full of restaurant photos, and rooftop parties. The type of life that looks effortless from the outside. And judging by the pictures, Daniel had already appeared in a few of them. Not clearly, just small details. A man's hand holding a wine glass, a reflection in a window, a silhouette sitting across a dinner table. Subtle, but obvious, once you knew what to look for. And then I noticed something else. One of the photos had been posted on the same night as my second chemotherapy session, while I was sitting in a hospital chair. Daniel had apparently been sitting across from Natalie at a rooftop bar. That realization didn't make me cry. It made me calm, because by that point, I had already started planning something. If Daniel wanted to lie while I was fighting cancer, then I wasn't going to expose him quietly. Quiet consequences are forgettable, but public consequences are permanent. And Daniel loved attention. The respect of coworkers, the admiration of friends, the reputation of being the devoted husband. Everyone believed he was standing beside his sick wife through the hardest moment of her life, and that reputation was about to become the most interesting part of the story. Because once people learned what he was actually doing during my treatments, they would remember his name for a very long time. Once you stop seeing someone as the person you loved and start seeing them as the person they really are, your entire perspective changes. You stop listening to the excuses. You stop believing the stories. And instead, you start documenting everything. For the next 3 weeks, that's exactly what I did. Daniel still believed I was fragile, weak from treatment, too exhausted to notice anything, which meant he stopped hiding as carefully. He left his phone unlocked more often, stepped outside for longer calls, sometimes even smiled at messages, while sitting beside me in the hospital. And every time it happened, I noticed. But instead of confronting him, I collected information, screenshots, messages, dates, times. The timeline started forming very quickly. Daniel and Natalie had been seeing each other for almost 4 months, which meant something interesting. Their relationship had started before my diagnosis, but my illness had made it easier because Daniel had discovered something incredibly useful. People don't question a husband who says he's visiting his sick wife. Hospital visits create the perfect alibi. No one checks, no one doubts, no one asks too many questions, which meant Daniel could disappear for hours at a time, and everyone believed he was being supportive, except he wasn't always at the hospital. Sometimes he left early, sometimes he arrived late, sometimes he stopped somewhere else entirely. Restaurants, wine bars, hotel lounges, all the places Natalie liked to go. One evening, I discovered something that almost made me laugh. Daniel had taken Natalie to a small Italian restaurant downtown, a place I recognized instantly because it was the restaurant where Daniel and I celebrated our anniversary every year. Same table, same wine, same view of the river, except this time, the person sitting across from him wasn't his wife. It was the woman he was texting while I was in chemotherapy. The more evidence I collected, the more obvious the story became. Daniel wasn't just cheating. He was living 2 completely separate lives. One life where he was the devoted husband supporting his sick wife, and another life where he was the charming, carefree boyfriend, taking Natalie to expensive restaurants. And the strangest part? He believed those 2 worlds would never collide. But secrets like that rarely stay separated forever, especially when someone starts connecting the pieces. By the end of the 3rd week, I had everything. Photos, messages, call logs, receipts, enough proof to destroy Daniel's reputation 10 times over. But the most powerful piece of evidence was something much simpler, a video. I recorded it during my 6th chemotherapy session. Daniel was sitting beside me, holding my hand, talking softly to a nurse, the perfect image of a supportive husband. Then, the phone buzzed. Natalie's name appeared on the screen. Daniel glanced at it, stood up, and stepped into the hallway to answer, exactly like he had done the first time. The camera on my phone captured everything: his voice, his tone, his affection. "Hey," he whispered, "I miss you too." The contrast was devastating. Inside the hospital room, a sick wife receiving chemotherapy. Outside in the hallway, a husband whispering romantic promises to someone else. That video was only 30 seconds long, but it told the entire story. By that point, I understood something very important. Divorce would be easy, quiet, private. Daniel would apologize, move on with Natalie, and eventually, everyone would forget. But forgetting felt wrong, because betrayal during normal life is painful, but betrayal during cancer treatment is something else entirely. So instead of confronting him, I started preparing something different, a story. And once that story reached the right audience, Daniel wouldn't just be a cheating husband. He would be something far more memorable. The man who cheated on his wife while she was fighting cancer. And people remember stories like that very well. By the time I finished collecting the evidence, the decision was already made, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted the truth to exist somewhere permanent. Secrets disappear easily. Apologies get forgotten. People rewrite stories in ways that make themselves look better. But the internet remembers everything. For 3 days, I worked quietly on something Daniel would never expect. I organized the messages, the dates, the screenshots, the receipts, the photos, each piece of evidence placed in order, each moment connected to the next, the entire timeline of his double life. Then I added the video, the 30-second clip from the chemotherapy room, Daniel holding my hand, standing up, walking into the hallway, whispering to Natalie. The contrast between those two moments told the entire story. A devoted husband inside the room, a cheating boyfriend outside the door, once everything was ready. I wrote something simple, not angry, not dramatic, just honest. A short story about illness, about trust, about discovering the truth in the middle of chemotherapy. I never used insults. I never exaggerated anything. I simply described exactly what happened. Then I added the evidence, screenshots, photos, the video. Finally, I pressed post. The first hour was quiet. Only a few friends saw it. A few messages appeared, supportive comments, concern, shock. Then something unexpected happened. One of my friends shared the story. Another friend shared it again. Then someone I didn't know reposted the video. Within 3 hours, thousands of people had seen it. Because stories like that travel fast. A husband cheating during his wife's cancer treatment isn't something people scroll past easily. By midnight, the video had spread far beyond my friends. Strangers were commenting, sharing, arguing, and Daniel's name started appearing everywhere. The next morning, his phone exploded. Calls, messages, emails. Not from Natalie, from his coworkers, his boss, his friends, because someone had recognized him in the video, the office building behind him, his name tag, his voice. Suddenly, the private story Daniel thought he controlled was public. When he came home that evening, he looked like someone who had just walked into a storm. "What did you do?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry, it was terrified. I closed my laptop slowly. I told the truth. Daniel ran his hands through his hair, pacing across the room. "It's everywhere," he said. "I know. My boss called me. I imagine he did. My mother saw it." That part made him stop pacing. "My mother called me crying," he said quietly. The silence between us lasted several seconds, because for the first time, Daniel understood something. The reputation he had spent years building had collapsed in a single night, all because he believed his secret life would never be seen. But the most interesting part of the entire situation was Natalie, because once the story began spreading online, her name started appearing too, and suddenly being part of Daniel's life was no longer glamorous. It was humiliating, which meant the final stage of the story was about to begin, because people who enjoy attention during happy moments rarely stay when that attention turns negative, and Daniel had just become the most famous man in the worst possible way. The internet moves fast, but shame moves even faster. By the morning after the post, Daniel's life looked very different. When he woke up, his phone was already buzzing. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of messages, notifications he couldn't even scroll through fast enough, because the video had continued spreading overnight. People had started sharing it on different platforms, clipping parts of it, adding captions, discussing the story, and with every new share, more people recognized Daniel, co-workers, former classmates, friends from years ago, even distant relatives. The first real consequence arrived around 9 a.m. Daniel's boss called. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When Daniel hung up, his face looked completely empty. "What happened?" I asked quietly. He sat down slowly at the kitchen table. They told me not to come into the office. Temporary leave? Daniel shook his head. They called it an investigation. Of course they did. Companies don't like scandals, especially the kind that spreads across the internet in less than 24 hours. And Daniel worked in finance, a business built entirely on reputation. The next call came 30 minutes later, his mother. I didn't hear the entire conversation, but I heard enough. "How could you do that?" she asked through the phone. Daniel didn't answer immediately. "I didn't think." "That woman is fighting cancer," she said. The sentence hung in the air, even after the call ended, because suddenly, Daniel's actions had a name. Not just cheating, not just lying, something worse. Cruelty. The final call of the morning came from Natalie. Daniel hesitated before answering, but eventually, he picked up. The conversation was short, very short. "What did you expect?" Natalie said sharply. Daniel tried to interrupt, but she kept talking. "My name is everywhere now. People are messaging me. My friends saw the video." Daniel's voice sounded desperate. "Listen, we can figure this out." "No," she said. Just one word. Then, the call ended. Daniel lowered the phone slowly, like someone who had just realized he was standing alone. Because that was the truth now. The relationship that once looked exciting and glamorous had vanished the moment it became embarrassing. Natalie didn't want to be part of a scandal, and Daniel had become the center of one. By the afternoon, small news blogs started picking up the story, not major media, but enough attention to push the video even further. Headlines appeared. "Woman documents husband's affair during cancer treatment." Video shows man whispering to mistress outside chemo room. Daniel stared at one article on his phone for a long time. "They're using my name," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. He looked at me slowly. "You really did make me famous." I didn't answer, because the strange part was I hadn't forced anything. I hadn't exaggerated the story. I hadn't edited the video. All I had done was show people the truth. And sometimes, the truth spreads faster than any lie. But the story wasn't finished yet, because there was still one final part. Daniel hadn't fully understood. The attention he was experiencing now was only the beginning. The strange thing about public scandals is how quickly they burn. The first few days are chaos. Everyone is talking. Everyone is sharing. Everyone has an opinion. But eventually, the noise fades. The story stops trending. People move on to something else. However, the consequences remain. 2 weeks after the video went viral, Daniel lost his job. Officially, the company said it was a reputational concern. Unofficially, no financial firm wants their employee known as the man who cheated on his wife during cancer treatment. Reputation matters in that industry. Trust matters even more. Daniel packed his office in less than an hour. A small box, a few framed photos, a coffee mug. Most of his coworkers avoided eye contact. Some looked uncomfortable. A few looked angry. But the worst reaction was silence. Because silence is how people distance themselves from someone they no longer respect. Natalie disappeared even faster. Her social media accounts went private. Old photos were deleted. Comments disabled. For someone who once loved attention, she suddenly wanted none of it. And Daniel was left with something he had never expected. Time. A lot of it. Unemployed, isolated. Watching the same video that everyone else had already seen. The 30-second clip from the chemotherapy room. He watched it again and again. The moment where he held my hand, the moment where he stepped into the hallway, the moment where he whispered to someone else. every time he watched it, the same realization returned. That was the moment. His life changed. Meanwhile, my life was moving in a different direction. The treatments continued, more chemotherapy, more hospital visits, more long days in waiting rooms. But something had changed. The secret was gone. The lies were gone. The weight of pretending everything was fine was gone. Friends visited more often. Family called every day. Even strangers sent messages of encouragement. And strangely, those messages helped more than I expected. Because illness can feel isolating. But knowing people were paying attention, knowing people cared, made the fight feel less lonely. 3 months later, my doctor delivered the news I had been hoping for. The treatment was working. Not finished, not easy, but working. And that moment felt like the real victory of the entire story. The divorce papers were finalized shortly after. Quiet, efficient, without much discussion. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't try to negotiate. He barely spoke during the entire process, because by that point, he had already lost everything that mattered to him. His job, his reputation, his relationship, his marriage, all for something. That lasted only a few months. The last time I saw him was outside the courthouse. He looked thinner, older, like someone who had aged years in a very short time. "I never thought it would go this far," he said quietly. I looked at him for a moment. "You made a lot of choices," I replied. He nodded slowly. "I guess I did." Then he asked the question people always ask. "Do you regret posting it?" I thought about that carefully. Not the anger, not the embarrassment, not the chaos that followed, but the truth itself. "No," I said, because the reality is simple. I didn't make Daniel famous. Daniel made himself famous. All I did was show the world who he really was. And sometimes, that's the most powerful story anyone can tell.